I dreamt of singing with him, but of course he died so young that obviously
Elvis we're talking about.
Elvis, yeah. I'm still here.
They called him Britain's Elvis. But Cliff Richard knew the truth. He wasn't chasing a crown. He was escaping a curse. While the world saw Elvis rise, Cliff saw the cost. The pills, the pressure, the prison of fame. And one day, he walked away. Not from music, but from the myth. For decades, he stayed silent. But now, Cliff Richard is ready to tell the truth about Elvis, about the industry, and about the price of becoming a god. Cliff Richard versus Elvis Presley. In the history of music, very few names have left an imprint as lasting as Elvis Presley and Cliff Richard. They are giants from different sides of the Atlantic. One born in Tupelo, Mississippi. The other raised in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire. Both found fame in the late 1950s. Both became symbols of youth and rebellion. And both dominated the charts for decades. But that's where the similarities start to fracture, because their careers followed extremely different arcs and were shaped by different cultures, ambitions, and personal choices. Cliff Richard was often referred to as the United Kingdom's version of Elvis Presley. But over time, it became clear that he wasn't just an imitator, he was a force in his own right. Cliff's contributions to British pop music are difficult to overstate. With a career spanning more than 6 decades, he sold over 250 million records globally. He charted over 67 UK top 10 singles, a number second only to Elvis. 14 of those singles went straight to #1, and his hits like We Don't Talk Anymore, Bachelor Boy, and Congratulations became anthems of their time and remain embedded in British pop culture to this very day. Even more impressively, Cliff achieved something no other artist had done, scoring #1 singles in 5 consecutive decades, from the 1950s to the 1990s. But his consistency wasn't just about catchy tunes. It was about his ability to adapt without compromising his personal values. Whether performing with the Shadows or leading his own solo projects, Cliff always maintained a wholesome image that contrasted sharply with many of his peers. Cliff was also twice selected to represent the UK at Eurovision, first in 1968 with Congratulations, which finished second, and again in 1973 with Power to All Our Friends. But his reach extended beyond the music scene. Cliff was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in 1995, becoming the first pop star to receive that honor, not just for his contribution to music, but also for his decades-long commitment to charity and humanitarian work. He even earned a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a rare accomplishment for a British artist who spent most of his career outside the United States market. On the other hand, Elvis Presley is a global phenomenon who needs no introduction. While Cliff ruled Britain, Elvis conquered the world. With an estimated 1 billion records sold, Elvis remains one of the best-selling solo artists in history. His impact on the development of rock and roll is immeasurable. He was the catalyst that brought the genre into mainstream American households, fusing rhythm and blues, country and gospel into a sound that changed music forever. Elvis scored 18 #1 hits on the Billboard Hot 100 and won 3 Grammy Awards, along with a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1971. He was inducted into 4 major music halls of fame: rock and roll, gospel, country, and rhythm and blues, an achievement that speaks volumes about his musical versatility and broad influence. That's not all. His 1973 Aloha from Hawaii concert, broadcast via satellite, reached more than 1 billion people, making it one of the most watched live television events at the time. He also had a prolific film career, appearing in over 31 scripted features and 2 major concert documentaries. Even after his death, Elvis's legacy has only grown. In 2018, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. Graceland, his home in Memphis, has become one of the most visited private residences in America, drawing hundreds of thousands of fans each year. In terms of public image, Elvis represented rebellion and challenged the conservative norms of the 1950s, while Cliff was more refined, buttoned up, and known for his ageless appearance and clean living lifestyle. And while Elvis's personal life was filled with excess, substance abuse, and a tragic early death at just 42, Cliff managed to avoid the same pitfalls. He remained scandal-free for most of his career, carefully curating his image and staying out of the typical celebrity minefield. Despite their differing paths, it's impossible to talk about one without referencing the other, especially in Cliff's case. For decades, comparisons between the two men shaped public perception of Cliff's music. Some saw him as an Elvis imitator. Others argued he was Britain's only real answer to the king of rock and roll. But what did Cliff himself think? What did he really feel about Elvis, his music, his fame, and his tragic downfall? For the most part, Cliff remained respectful whenever Elvis's name came up in interviews. But privately, it seems he held deeper thoughts that were conflicted. And now, we finally know what Cliff Richard kept to himself and his complicated feelings about the man who cast a long shadow over his career. What Cliff saw in Elvis Presley. For decades, Cliff Richard maintained a respectful silence whenever Elvis Presley's name came up. He paid tribute in interviews, praised his influence, and avoided controversy. But Cliff finally opened up more honestly, not to diminish Elvis's legacy, but to shed light on what it was like growing up in the enormous shadow of the king of rock and roll. And more importantly, what it meant to admire someone so deeply while quietly deciding not to follow in their footsteps. Cliff has never hidden the fact that Elvis Presley was the spark that lit his own musical fire. He was quite young when he first heard Elvis's voice. That moment, by all accounts, changed everything for him. The sound was different, cool, young, and filled with this strange, unspoken promise. Cliff didn't just hear Elvis, he felt him. And like millions of other teens around the world, he wanted to be him. Speaking about the first time he heard Elvis sing, Cliff said, "I had never heard anything like it in my life. Norman, Terry, and I spent the whole afternoon gabbling about how great it had sounded and how we had to find out what it was." In those early days, Cliff tried to copy Elvis. He studied his performance style, mirrored his stage posture, and even adopted his hairstyle. There are photos of Cliff from his first few years in music, where the resemblance to Elvis is so close. It's almost startling. He wore slicked-back hair, dressed in high collars and moody dark jackets, and even adopted the same subtle lip curl in some of his early press shots. He was absorbing, learning, and reconstructing himself in the image of his hero. Cliff even went as far as mimicking parts of Elvis's off-stage life. One of the more amusing revelations Cliff shared in recent years involved Elvis's well-known love for peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Cliff, curious and impressionable, gave the snack a try, eager to taste what the king of rock and roll was so famously obsessed with. It was a small, almost innocent attempt to touch a little piece of Elvis's world. But as time went on, Cliff began to feel the tension between admiration and identity. Being seen as Britain's Elvis was both flattering and suffocating. On one hand, it meant he had arrived, that people saw him as the UK's response to the biggest music star in the world. But on the other hand, it reduced him to a copy, a reflection of someone else's image, rather than a star in his own right. And Cliff quietly began to pull away from that narrative. He acknowledged that Elvis was one of the reasons he picked up a guitar, stepped on stage and believed a boy like him could become a music legend. But at some point, Cliff began to see the warning signs. Elvis wasn't just a global icon. He was a man fighting so many personal demons. The fame that had looked so thrilling from a distance was, in reality, overwhelming. The lifestyle, so glamorous on magazine covers, was filled with pressure, isolation, and unchecked indulgence. And it didn't take long to realize that he didn't want to be a man chasing youth forever, or a man who would burn out in the spotlight. That's where Cliff made the critical decision that would define the course of his life and career. He chose discipline and self-control, and he turned to faith. While Elvis drifted deeper into the excesses of Hollywood, surrounded by handlers and feeding off adoration, Cliff pulled back from the frenzy and found stability in religion and a more deliberate lifestyle. And perhaps that's what preserved him. Cliff has spoken about how quickly fame consumed Elvis. He saw what that kind of unrelenting pressure could do to a person, especially someone who didn't have the right people around to pull him back from the edge. Although he didn't condemn Elvis, he made a conscious decision not to go down the same road. While Elvis's later performances grew more theatrical and erratic, Cliff focused on consistency and longevity. He reinvented his sound slowly, kept himself grounded, and always made space between his public and private lives. That separation between the man on stage and the man off it is one of the reasons Cliff endured while others faded. He made the decision to not allow the glitz and glamour of celebrity life to define him. This was a lesson he learned from watching Elvis up close, especially from seeing how fame, left unchecked, could slowly consume the person behind the persona. In an interview, he said, "When I broke through, I started getting called the English Elvis, or the British answer to Elvis. I no longer think, what would Elvis do, whenever I have any big decisions to make, as I did in my earliest years. I've been through that. I stopped being the English Elvis and started being me a long time ago." Over the years, Cliff has revealed that his admiration for Elvis never really faded. But what changed was his understanding of what it cost. Elvis was brilliant. There was no denying that. But he was also fragile, increasingly dependent on prescription medication, and surrounded by people who rarely told him no. For Cliff, that kind of life was not just unsustainable, it was ultimately tragic. Although Cliff still thinks of Elvis with reverence, there's a kind of sorrow attached to it, not just because Elvis died so young, but because he never had the chance to grow old with his music. And perhaps the most striking revelation of all is that Cliff doesn't romanticize the past. He doesn't pretend Elvis was perfect, nor does he downplay the influence Elvis had on him. Instead, he recognizes the full picture that made up the iconic Elvis Presley, from his brilliance to his charisma, mistakes, and tragic downfall. While the world still remembers Elvis as the king, Cliff remembers the man behind the crown, the isolation he faced, the health decline, and the unraveling. But how did it all go so wrong? Elvis Presley's health decline. By the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley was still selling out arenas and breaking attendance records, but behind the stage, a much darker reality was playing out. The world still saw him as the king, the icon, and the legend, but those closest to him knew something was terribly wrong. But the signs had been there for years. They were just easier to ignore while the lights were still on, and the music was still playing. Elvis had built his entire career on charm, movement, and energy. But the man who once electrified stages with ease gradually became a shadow of himself. His weight fluctuated dramatically, and reports estimated that he gained as much as 90 pounds over the course of 17 years. This wasn't simply the result of aging or comfort eating. It was the physical toll of depression, isolation, and years of unchecked habits. By the early 70s, Elvis was battling more than just the pressures of fame. Behind closed doors, he was struggling with a growing list of health problems. He was diagnosed with glaucoma, a condition that affected his vision, and hypertension that required constant medication. Liver disease had begun to take hold, and degenerative disc disease left him in chronic pain, often unable to stand for long periods without discomfort. But despite his doctor's warnings, Elvis kept performing. Canceling shows was out of the question. His pride and the industry around him wouldn't allow it. It wasn't only physical pain that weighed him down. Those close to Elvis described long periods of emotional withdrawal. He became increasingly private, spending days alone in his room at Graceland, with the curtains drawn and disconnected from reality. The once vibrant star who joked with fans and flirted with cameras was now quiet, introspective, and often unreachable. In fact, there were rumors of paranoia and whispers that he didn't trust the people around him. A large part of this decline can be traced to his dependence on prescription medication. Unlike illicit substances, which come with a clear social stigma, what Elvis relied on came from doctors, men he trusted, or at least believed he could. He went from stimulants to help him stay alert to painkillers, to help with his back and joints, and later to sleeping medication to combat his insomnia. Over time, this combination became increasingly dangerous. The dosages were adjusted, mixed, and stacked to maintain appearances on stage, and even his closest aides could barely keep up with how much he was indulging. By the time Elvis entered the final years of his life, touring had become a physically punishing task. He was often too exhausted to travel for studio sessions, so he had a room in Graceland, converted into a makeshift recording space. The Jungle Room, as it was famously known, became the unlikely setting for his last recordings. These sessions were quieter and more somber. The energy that once defined his sound was no longer there. What remained was the voice of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and had no space left to hide. One of the most haunting observations about this period came from Ed Parker, a longtime friend and bodyguard. He described Elvis not as a superstar in decline, but as a human being who had been drained too many times, like a battery that had given all it had and was now running on fumes. It was a fitting description. Elvis wasn't simply burnt out. He was depleted emotionally, physically, and spiritually. When Elvis died in August 1977 at the age of just 42, the world was stunned. But for those who had watched his final years up close, it didn't come as a surprise. The toxicology reports conducted after his death revealed a grim picture. Multiple prescription harmful substances were found in his system, including strong sedatives, painkillers, and stimulants. None of them were illegal on their own, but together they formed a dangerous and ultimately fatal combination. The public grief that followed was immense. Crowds gathered at Graceland. News stations across the world ran tributes. But beneath the mourning was a deeper question. How did this happen? How did a man with so much talent, so much power, and so many resources reach such a tragic end? Some blamed the people around him, including his managers, doctors, and associates, who enabled his dependence instead of challenging it. Others pointed to the machine of fame itself. The unrelenting demand for more, the pressure to stay young, and the fear of becoming irrelevant. And then there were those who believed Elvis simply couldn't stop giving, that he stayed on stage long past the point of comfort because he didn't know how to do anything else. However, in hindsight, it's clear that Elvis's final years weren't just a personal collapse. They were a cautionary tale, A warning about what happens when the world sees you as an icon, but forgets you're still a person. About what happens when no one dares to say no to the star everyone depends on. And for Cliff Richard, watching from afar, the message was loud and clear. Cliff had idolized Elvis for years, but what he saw in those final years shook him. It wasn't just the weight gain or the erratic behavior. It was the sadness in Elvis's eyes, the loss of control, and perhaps the worst part, the fact that it all played out in plain sight, yet nobody could do anything to stop it. At the end of the day, watching Elvis's decline helped shape many of Cliff's own choices. He didn't want the kind of fame Elvis had. He didn't want to be remembered as a caricature of his younger self. He didn't want to be 80 years old and pretending to be 25. And most of all, he didn't want to be surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. But Cliff's own journey wasn't without its own shadows. For all his discipline and faith, he too would face storms that were both public and deeply personal. The man who avoided Elvis's fate wasn't entirely free from the costs of fame, and the battle that came for him would test everything he stood for. The silence that nearly broke Cliff. For all the discipline, control, and moral compass Cliff Richard had built his life around, nothing could have prepared him for what happened in 2014. After decades of a spotless reputation and carefully maintained boundaries, Cliff suddenly found himself at the center of a national scandal that came without warning and without mercy. That summer, the British Broadcasting Corporation aired live footage of South Yorkshire police raiding Cliff's Berkshire apartment. The images were broadcast globally before Cliff even knew what was happening. He wasn't home, and he hadn't even been arrested. In fact, no charges had been filed. But none of that seemed to matter because the damage was instant. Headlines exploded, and speculation ran wild. Cliff, a man who had never so much as been photographed drunk in public, was suddenly being linked to a criminal investigation involving historic inappropriate behavior allegations. The accusations, as it turned out, were completely false. After a lengthy investigation, no charges were brought, but the damage had already been done to Cliff's reputation and mental health. Cliff later described that period as the lowest moment of his life, not just because of the accusations themselves, but because of the silence that followed. The people who had once praised him fell quiet. The media tore through his reputation without hesitation, and for a time, it felt like the truth didn't matter. During the ordeal, Cliff admitted that his mental state deteriorated rapidly. He spoke candidly about the terrible thoughts that crossed his mind, the sleepless nights, and the psychological weight of being portrayed as something he knew he wasn't. This wasn't just a career crisis, it was a personal collapse. For a man who had spent decades keeping his private life guarded and scandal-free, it was a complete rupture of everything he had worked to protect. What made it worse was the way the story had been handled. The BBC, later criticized in court, had coordinated with law enforcement to film the raid. The result was a public spectacle and a real-time shaming of someone who hadn't even been charged. Cliff eventually sued both the BBC and South Yorkshire Police. He won, but even that couldn't fully erase the toll. Out of the ashes of that episode came one of Cliff's most vocal campaigns. He began advocating for a change in UK law, specifically the right for suspects in inappropriate behavior-related cases to remain anonymous unless and until they are charged. For Cliff, this wasn't just personal, it was about principle. He believed that false accusations, no matter how rare, had the power to destroy lives long before the truth could catch up. But Cliff's challenges haven't only been legal. His personal life has long been a subject of fascination, speculation, and, in many cases, misunderstanding. One of the most consistent threads throughout his career has been his decision never to marry. But it wasn't due to a lack of opportunity or interest. As a matter of fact, Cliff had several serious relationships, but ultimately, he chose a different path. He was open about having been in love more than once. In the early 1980s, Cliff dated former Wimbledon tennis star Sue Barker. The relationship was serious enough that the press began predicting an engagement. But while Cliff clearly cared for Sue, he later admitted that he didn't feel the depth of connection required to commit to marriage. According to Cliff, he knew the stakes, and he wasn't willing to promise something he couldn't fully give. Before that, in the 1960s, Cliff had dated dancer Jackie Irving, and even earlier, a woman named Delia Wicks. Delia later revealed in a letter that Cliff ended things with her gently, explaining that the demands of fame and his own inner conflict left little room for a traditional relationship. He remained respectful but resolute. He wanted to focus on his career and, in time, on his spiritual calling. That meant letting go of relationships that could not fully align with that vision. Later in life, Cliff maintained a long-term companionship with John Macklin, a former Catholic priest and American missionary. The nature of their relationship sparked years of rumors and press questions. Some speculated it was romantic. Others called it a close friendship. Cliff, for his part, refused to apply labels. He simply said that John was someone who shared his faith, his values, and his home life. They traveled together, lived together, and supported one another. Cliff never hid that bond, but he also never gave in to pressure to define it for the public. But this resistance to definition has been a theme throughout Cliff's life. He refused to let the press dictate how he should live, who he should love, or what his faith should look like. He made decisions that were unconventional for a pop star. He's had no wild affairs, no children, no divorces, and no stints in rehab. But that doesn't mean it was easy. Cliff has admitted to periods of loneliness, confusion, and longing. He was not immune to the emotional costs of choosing solitude and privacy, but he also believed those costs were worth paying. What truly sets Cliff apart from many of his peers is how openly he has discussed those tensions without ever slipping into self-pity. He speaks about his life with clarity and never pretends he got everything right. In many ways, he turned restraint into freedom. And the same self-discipline that kept him grounded during fame also helped him survive personal storms that would have undone others. But perhaps the most admirable part of Cliff's life is the way he never allowed any of his challenges, whether legal, personal, or emotional, to harden him. He remained gracious, forgave those who doubted him, and rebuilt his reputation slowly by simply continuing to be who he always was. To this day, Cliff Richard remains one of the few performers from his generation still selling out shows, recording new music, and engaging with fans without bitterness. And while his personal story has been far less tragic than Elvis's, it's also been far more complex than many people realize. But how did two men who lived under the same spotlight choose such different paths? One became a tragic story, the other became a survivor. And although their legacies couldn't be more different, they both tell us something about what fame really costs and the price Elvis Presley had to pay. Cliff's biggest regret. To Cliff Richard, Elvis Presley will always be more than just the king of rock and roll. But he's not just a musical icon or a historical benchmark. He's a lesson, a warning, and a symbol of what happens when fame becomes a cage instead of a platform. Perhaps one of Cliff's biggest points of pain when it comes to Elvis is the fact that he never got to meet him in person. Despite being one of Britain's biggest stars, Cliff never met the man who started it all for him. And to date, that regret runs deep. Although he came close a few times, the moment never came. After Elvis died, Cliff admitted it left a hole nothing could fill. Not because he needed validation, but because he wanted to look into the eyes of the man who unknowingly shaped his life. While promoting Devil Woman in the United States, Cliff Richard was asked in an interview about his biggest musical influence. Without hesitation, he credited Elvis Presley, saying that without Elvis, his own career might never have existed. The interviewer, intrigued, offered to set up a meeting with Elvis on the condition that any photos taken would be exclusive to his newspaper. Cliff immediately agreed, with just one request, that he be given a personal copy of the pictures afterward. However, in a later interview, Cliff confessed that after the interview was over, he postponed the meeting with Elvis. He said, "Let's wait, because Elvis had gone through a period of putting on a lot of weight. And I just thought, if I'm going to have me and Elvis on my refrigerator, I'd really like him to look good." He went on to say, "The thing is, I regret it now, because he died not long after that. I think none of us knew that was going to happen. I was stupid, really, and I regret it to this day. I'd love to be able to say to you, yes, I did meet Elvis, but I didn't. And as much as he loved Elvis, he's learned from the same pitfalls Elvis suffered. Even today, well into his 80s, Cliff lives with a level of self-control that seems almost monastic. He reportedly eats just one main meal a day, avoids sugar, and steers clear of processed foods, and stays active. In fact, he gave up things he once loved, including certain foods and drinks, simply because he knew what was at stake. He doesn't see discipline as a sacrifice. He sees it as a shield. And in that philosophy, the contrast with Elvis becomes painfully clear. Elvis, for all his brilliance, couldn't draw the same lines. He kept saying yes when he should have said no, kept performing when he should have stopped, and he kept trusting people who never challenged his worst instincts. And now, as the years pass and new generations discover both men's music, the contrast becomes even more powerful. Elvis will always be remembered for how brightly he burned. Cliff, for how long he endured. Elvis Presley or Cliff Richard? Who's your favorite artist? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.